The last person who had spoken to the Dragon King died screaming. That was the story they told in the villages below the Ashen Mount, whispered over cook fires, pressed into the ears of children who wandered too close to the mountain road. A century ago, Lord Dragon Voss had opened his mouth to issue a command, and what came out was not words, but fire. It melted the throne room floor into black glass. It turned his closest advisor to ash between one heartbeat and the next. And when the flames died and the smoke cleared, the Dragon King closed his mouth and did not open it again. 100 years of silence. 100 years of a kingdom ruled by gesture, by the scratch of quill on parchment, by the trembling interpretations of advisors who claimed to understand what the king meant when he turned his hand or narrowed his ancient, gold-slitted eyes. His court functioned, barely. His wolves obeyed, fearfully. His fortress stood at the summit of the Ashen Mount like a fang of black stone, and no one who entered it felt warm. They said his voice was the curse, that a witch had poisoned his bloodline so that every word he spoke would carry dragon fire. Not the controlled flame of a shifting king, but wild, devouring destruction. They said he had chosen silence to save what remained of his people. They said it was noble. Seraphine Vale thought it sounded like a prison. But she was not thinking about the Dragon King when the soldiers dragged her through the gates of Ashen Mount. She was thinking about the bruise swelling her left eye shut, the iron taste of blood on her split lip, and the fact that her stepmother had finally found a way to be rid of her permanently. "Tribute," the captain announced, shoving her forward onto the frost-covered stones of the outer courtyard. "From the Vale household, as payment for 3 seasons of unpaid territorial tax." Seraphine caught herself before her knees hit the ground. Barely. Her wrists were bound with rope that had rubbed the skin raw, and the thin dress they had given her, deliberately, cruelly, offered nothing against the mountain cold. She could see her breath. She could feel the ice forming on her eyelashes. But she did not kneel. The courtyard was full of wolves. Warriors in leather and iron, their eyes catching the torchlight with an animal gleam that marked them as shifted-blooded. Beta commanders with scarred faces, servants who had stopped mid-task to stare at the bruised woman standing where no one stood willingly. And above them all, on a balcony carved from the black stone of the mountain itself, a figure watched. She could not see his face clearly. The torchlight did not reach that high, and shadows clung to him like a second skin. But she could feel him. A pressure in the air, a weight against her chest, as though the atmosphere itself bent around him. The wolves in the courtyard kept their eyes down, every single one. Seraphine looked up. Something shifted in the darkness on that balcony. A subtle movement, a head tilting perhaps. Gold light flickered where his eyes should have been. 2 points of molten amber that locked onto her face with an intensity that stopped her breath. The captain was still talking, listing her stepmother's debts, her status as an omega of the Vale Pack, her value as a servant or... He paused, glancing up at the balcony. Whatever the king saw fit. His voice carried the bored efficiency of a man delivering livestock. Seraphine did not look away from those golden eyes. She did not know why. There was no defiance in it, no calculated bravery. She simply could not turn from him. Something in her chest had gone very still, like a held breath, like the moment before a flame catches. The Dragon King raised one hand. The courtyard went silent. The captain stopped mid-sentence. Even the wind seemed to obey. His hand moved. A single gesture, 2 fingers drawing downward, and the beta at the base of the balcony stepped forward. "She stays," the beta said. His voice was rough, as though he spent most of his time growling. "Cut the ropes, give her quarters in the east wing." "The east wing?" The captain's composure cracked. Those are noble chambers." The beta's expression did not change. Did I stutter? When the ropes fell from her wrists, Seraphine rubbed the raw skin and finally looked away from the balcony. The golden eyes were gone. The shadows had closed over the space where the Dragon King had stood, like water over a stone. But the pressure in her chest remained, a warmth she could not explain, low and steady, like an ember buried beneath ash. The east wing was not what she expected. She had prepared herself for a cell, clean perhaps, but cold and bare. Instead, a servant named Marin, a small, silver-haired woman with kind eyes and a permanent limp, led her to a chamber with a fire already burning in the hearth. Furs on the bed, a window that overlooked the valley below, where the clouds broke against the mountainside like waves. "You'll want to eat," Marin said, setting a tray of bread, dried meat and hot broth on the table beside the bed. Her eyes lingered on Seraphine's bruises with a quiet fury that she did not voice. "And I'll bring salve for your face." "Why am I here?" Seraphine asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Marin paused at the door. "Because he gestured for you to be." "That's not an answer." The old woman's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "It's the only kind of answer anyone gets in this fortress, child. The king does not explain. He has not explained anything in 100 years. The door closed softly. Seraphine sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the fire, and pressed her hand against the strange warmth still pulsing behind her ribs. Over the days that followed, she learned the rhythms of Ashenmount. The fortress operated in near silence. Not the comfortable quiet of peace, but the tense hush of a court that had forgotten how to speak freely. Conversations happened in low murmurs. Orders were relayed through the beta. A massive wolf named Kale, who served as the king's voice, his interpreter, his shield against a world that required words. The Dragon King himself moved through his fortress like a ghost wrapped in shadow. She caught glimpses of him, crossing a corridor, standing at the edge of the training grounds watching his warriors spar, seated in the great hall at the head of a table where no one dared sit within 10 feet of him. He was tall, taller than any wolf she had seen, with dark hair that fell past his jaw and skin that held an undertone of ash, as though fire lived just beneath the surface. His eyes were always gold, not wolf gold, something older, something that burned. He never spoke. He never smiled. He moved with the careful precision of someone who knew that every part of him was a weapon. And he watched her. She felt it constantly, that golden gaze finding her across the great hall during meals, tracking her as she walked the frost-covered gardens that Marin had said once bloomed with winter roses. He watched her the way a man watches a fire he is afraid to touch. On the 5th night, Seraphine could not sleep. The wind howled through the mountain passes, and the cold crept under her door despite the fire. She wrapped a fur around her shoulders and wandered, not toward anywhere specific, just away from the silence of her own room. She found him in the library. It was a vast room, 2 stories of shelves carved directly into the mountain stone, lit by a fireplace large enough to stand in. He sat in a chair before the fire, a book open on his knee, and he was so still that she almost mistook him for part of the architecture. His head turned when she entered, gold eyes. The firelight painted half his face in warm light, and left the other half in shadow, and the effect was devastating, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Seraphine stopped in the doorway. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know anyone was here." He said nothing. Of course, he said nothing. She should have left. Any rational person would have. This was the Dragon King, the wolf whose voice burned the living to ash, who ruled through silence because the alternative was destruction. She was an Omega tribute, with a black eye and borrowed furs. But there was something in the way he held that book. His fingers pressed flat against the open page, not reading, but anchoring, as though, without something to hold, his hands might shake. She recognized that gesture. She had done it herself, pressing her palms against tables, walls, her own thighs, during every one of her stepmother's tirades, holding herself together by holding on to something solid. "You can't sleep either," she said quietly. Not a question. His jaw tightened. The gold of his eyes flared brighter for a moment. A warning, perhaps, or surprise. Seraphine crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite his. The fire crackled between them. She pulled her knees up, wrapped the fur tighter, and looked into the flames. "I used to read when I couldn't sleep," she said, "before my stepmother sold the books. She said Omegas didn't need stories, that we should be too tired from working to dream." She was not looking at him. She was looking at the fire, but she could feel the weight of his attention like a hand pressed against her back. "She was wrong, obviously," Seraphine continued. "Stories were the only thing that kept me sane. When everything else was taken, my mother's things, my room, eventually my name, because she insisted the servants call me girl instead, I could still disappear into someone else's life for a few hours." She paused. "I suppose that sounds foolish." Silence. But it was a different silence than before. She could feel it. The quality of the air had changed, the way it changes when someone leans closer without moving. She glanced at him. He was staring at her with an expression she could not name. The book was forgotten. His hands, large, scarred, with the faintest dark scaling along his knuckles that spoke of the dragon blood in his veins, had gone still against the armrests. And his eyes, those molten gold eyes, held something she had not seen in any gaze directed at her in years. He was listening. Not tolerating her presence, not waiting for her to leave. Listening. The way someone listens to music they thought they would never hear again. "The worst part wasn't the hitting," she said, and she did not know why she was telling him this, except that the fire was warm and the silence felt safe, and he was the first person in years who seemed to actually hear her. "It was the invisibility. Being treated as though you don't exist, as though your thoughts and your voice and your presence are an inconvenience the world is forced to tolerate. That's what breaks you. Not the pain, the erasure." She met his eyes. "I think you might understand that." The fire popped. A log shifted, sending a cascade of sparks up the chimney. In the orange light, she saw his throat work. A swallow, a visible effort at something she could not identify. Then his hand moved. Slowly, carefully, he reached toward the small table between their chairs. His fingers found a quill and a scrap of parchment, the tools of his only communication, and he wrote a single line. He held it out to her. She took it. The handwriting was precise but heavy, as though each letter cost him effort. "No one has sat with me in this room in 43 years. Her chest constricted. She read it twice. Then she looked up at him, and the expression on his face, raw, guarded, a man bracing for the moment. Kindness turns to cruelty. because it always does, nearly undid her. "Then I'll sit with you again tomorrow night," she said, "if you'll have me." Something cracked behind his eyes. Not pain, not quite. The ghost of a sensation he had forgotten the name for. He nodded. Once. If you've been enjoying this story so far, a like would mean so much. It tells me you want more like this. She kept her word. Every night for the next 3 weeks, Seraphine came to the library. She brought no agenda, no petitions, no requests. She brought herself. Her thoughts, her memories, her observations about the fortress and its people. She read to him from books she pulled from his own shelves, her voice filling the room the way his could not. And he listened. He wrote her notes, brief at first, a few words, a question, then longer, then pages. She learned the shape of his mind through ink, sharp, darkly humorous, achingly lonely. He asked her about her childhood with a ferocity that startled her, as though cataloguing every cruelty inflicted on her for some future reckoning. She asked him about the curse, and for 3 nights he did not answer. On the 4th night, he wrote, "The witch who cursed my bloodline was my mother. She could not control me, so she ensured I could never speak without destroying what I loved. Every word I say carries dragon fire. The more I care about the person I am speaking to, the more destructive the flame." Seraphine read it in the firelight, and something inside her went very still. "That's why you stopped," she whispered. "Not because you don't care, because you care too much." He stared at her. The gold of his eyes was liquid, molten, and his hands gripped the armrests of his chair so hard that the wood creaked. The scaling along his knuckles had spread, dark, iridescent lines creeping up his forearms. His control was slipping. She could see it. She did not step back. "Dragon," she said. His name, just his name, and his eyes closed as though the sound of it had struck him. His hand rose. Slowly, trembling visibly, he reached toward her face. His fingertips hovered a breath from her cheek, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, inhuman and searing, the dragon blood burning just below the surface. He did not touch her. He pulled his hand back and pressed it flat against his own chest, over his heart. And the look on his face, the anguished restraint of a man who wanted more than anything to reach out, and was terrified of what reaching out would cost, broke something open in Seraphine that she had spent years sealing shut. "You won't hurt me," she said. He shook his head. Not disagreement, despair. She reached out and placed her hand over his. The hand pressed to his chest. His skin was burning. She felt it sear her palm, felt the heat climb through her fingers, and she did not pull away. His breath stopped. Beneath her hand, beneath his hand, his heart was hammering. Wild, desperate. The heartbeat of a man who had not been touched with gentleness in a century. The scaling on his arms receded. The impossible heat cooled by a single degree. And in the fireplace, the flames, which had been roaring since she arrived, feeding on his proximity, on his barely leashed fire, dimmed to a gentle, steady glow. For the first time in 100 years, the fire in the Dragon King's presence behaved. Word of this reached Lord Saren before morning. Lord Saren had served as the king's chief advisor for 60 years. He was the one who controlled access to the king, who interpreted the gestures, who decided what the silent monarch meant and relayed it to the court. His power depended entirely on the king's isolation. A king who could not speak needed a voice, and Saren had made himself indispensable. A woman who made the king's fire dim was a threat to everything Saren had built. He moved carefully. First, whispers, planted among the court, spreading through the servants' quarters like smoke. The tribute girl was a witch. She was manipulating the king. She carried her own curse, and proximity to her would doom them all. The bruises she arrived with, proof of her own pack's judgment, an omega for a reason. Seraphine heard the whispers. She had survived worse. But Saren was not content with whispers. On the night of the Winter Assembly, a formal gathering of the court in the Great Hall, where the fire pit blazed and the carved wolf throne sat empty, because the Dragon King ruled from a chair of black stone behind it, Saren made his move. "The court demands an accounting," he announced, his voice ringing through the hall. He stood at the center of the room, silver-haired and imperious, addressing not the king, but the assembled wolves. A tribute Omega has been housed in noble quarters. She spends her nights alone with the king. She has been given access that warriors of 50 years' service have not earned. His gaze swept the room. What hold does this woman have over our king? The hall murmured. Wolves shifted, exchanged glances. On his black stone chair, Dragon sat motionless. But Seraphine, standing near the wall where Marin had positioned her, saw the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers curled against the armrest. "Bring her forward," Saren commanded. Guards moved toward her. Seraphine stepped forward before they could touch her, walking to the center of the hall with her spine straight and her hands steady at her sides. The firelight from the great pit cast her shadow long across the stone floor. "You have no bloodline," Saren said, circling her like a wolf assessing prey. "No rank, no power, no shifted form. You cannot even become what you are. You are the lowest creature in this fortress, and yet you sit at our king's side as though you belong there." He stopped, facing her. "Tell the court, what spell have you worked on him?" The hall was silent. Every eye was on her. Seraphine looked at Saren. Then she looked past him, at the Dragon King on his throne of black stone, his gold eyes burning in the firelight, his body rigid, with the effort of not moving, not reacting. Because reaction from him meant fire, and fire meant death. She understood in that moment the full scope of his prison. He could not defend her. He could not speak for her. He could not even growl without risking the lives of everyone in this room. So she would speak for herself. "I have worked no spell," she said, and her voice carried, clear, steady, resonant in the vast hall. "I have no magic. I have no bloodline worth naming, no power that any of you would recognize." She looked at Saren directly. "All I have done is sit with him, talk to him, treat him as a man instead of a monument." The murmur that rippled through the court was uneasy. "And if that is enough to threaten your position, Lord Saren," she continued, "then perhaps you should ask yourself what kind of position requires a king's isolation to survive." The silence that followed was absolute. Saren's face went white, then red. His hand moved to his belt, not to a weapon, but to a small vial hanging from a leather cord. A vial of dark liquid that Seraphine had never seen before, but that made Marin, standing at the edge of the hall, draw a sharp breath. You think kindness breaks curses? Saren's voice dropped. Dangerous now. The curse was designed to be unbreakable. I know, because I helped design it. The hall erupted. Wolves surged to their feet. Kale, the beta, moved towards Saren with murder in his eyes. But Saren was faster. He uncorked the vial and hurled its contents toward the fire pit. The dark liquid hit the flames and they exploded upward. Black fire, unnatural and screaming, pouring through the hall like a living thing. The curse, amplified, fed. Dragon convulsed on his throne. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and smoke poured from between his teeth. Not flame yet, but close. The scaling erupted across his skin, climbing his neck, his jaw. His eyes blazed white gold, and the temperature in the hall spiked until wolves nearest him staggered back from the heat. He was losing control. The curse was dragging the fire out of him, demanding release. And if he opened his mouth, if he made a single sound, the hall would burn. Everyone in it, including her. Seraphine ran to him. "Don't!" Kale shouted. "The heat will—" She reached the throne and placed both hands on his face. The heat was extraordinary. She felt her palms blister, felt the pain lance up her arms, and she did not let go. She held his face between her hands. This burning, breaking, ancient king, and she looked into his white gold eyes and said the words that no one in a century had thought to say. "You are not your fire," she said. "You are not your silence. You are not what she made you." His hands came up, clawed, scaled, trembling, and closed around her wrists, not pulling her away, holding on. "I see you," she whispered. "Not the king, not the curse. You. And you are so tired, Dragon. You are so tired of burning alone." A sound tore from his chest, not fire, not destruction. A sound like something ancient and calcified finally cracking apart. The scaling on his skin began to recede. The black fire in the pit shuddered, flickered, dimmed. The unbearable heat softened degree by degree, and where her hands pressed against his face, his skin cooled to something human, something warm instead of burning. His mouth opened, and for the first time in 100 years, the Dragon King spoke. Seraphine. One word, her name, spoken in a voice like deep earth and distant thunder, rough from a century of disuse, cracked and raw, and utterly, devastatingly human. No fire, no destruction. Just her name, spoken by a man who had been terrified that his voice could only destroy, discovering that it could also reach for the one person worth reaching for. The black fire in the pit went out. Not gradually, it simply ceased, as though it had never been. The normal flames returned, warm and golden, and in their light, the great hall stood stunned and silent. Seraphine's hands were still on his face. His were still on her wrists. Her palms were blistered and raw, and she was shaking. With pain, with adrenaline, with something enormous and unnamed that filled her chest like light. "Say it again," she whispered. His thumb traced the inside of her wrist, gently, so gently, as though she were made of something precious. His gold eyes were clear for the first time. Human, present, here. Seraphine, he said again, and his voice did not burn. It warmed. He stood from the black stone throne, his full height, towering, the Dragon King of Ashenmount with his wolf court bearing witness. And he did not look at Saren, who was being pinned to the floor by Kale's iron grip. He did not look at the wolves who had whispered about her, feared her, dismissed her. He looked only at her. My voice was taken because love was the trigger, he said, each word careful, measured, as though learning to speak again with every syllable. The more I cared, the more dangerous I became. My mother ensured I could never tell anyone what they meant to me without destroying them. His hand cupped her face, the same gesture he had pulled back from nights ago, but now completed. His palm against her cheek. Warm, not burning. You did not break the curse by being powerful. You broke it by being honest, by sitting with me when no one else would, by seeing the man and speaking to him as though he mattered. You do matter, she said. I know, he said. You taught me. He turned to the hall. His court, wolves who had served him in terrified silence for a century, stared back at him with expressions ranging from awe to tears. This woman, the Dragon King said, and his voice filled the great hall like a bell, like a hymn, resonant and deep and alive, is not a tribute. She is not a servant. She is not an omega. His hand found hers and lifted it, her blistered, shaking hand, and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a reverence that made hardened warriors look away. She is my mate. She is your Luna, and the next wolf who questions her place in this fortress will answer to my voice. The silence lasted 3 heartbeats. Then Kale, scarred, gruff, granite-faced Kale, dropped to one knee. The sound of his armored knee striking stone echoed through the hall. Behind him, one by one, the wolves of Ashenmount knelt. Maren was crying silently by the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth. Lord Saren was dragged from the hall in chains. He did not go quietly. He screamed about the old order, about bloodlines, about the natural hierarchy that demanded an omega never rise. But his voice grew fainter as the dungeon swallowed him, and by the time the great doors closed, he was simply gone. 3 months later, the gardens of Ashenmount bloomed. Not the frozen, grey-stemmed things that had survived the mountain winters through sheer stubbornness. Real flowers. Winter roses, just as Maren had described, their petals a deep, impossible crimson against the snow. They grew in the courtyard, along the corridors, and in a particular abundance outside the library window, where 2 chairs still sat before the fire every night. The Dragon King spoke now. Not constantly. A century of silence had made him deliberate with words, and he spent them carefully, like a man who understands their value. But his voice rang through the great hall during councils, warm and commanding. He laughed, a rare, startling sound that made his wolves grin like fools every time they heard it. He argued with Kale over territorial strategy in a voice that carried the deep resonance of dragon blood without any of its destruction. And every night, in the library, he read to her. His voice, that voice that had been a weapon, a curse, a cage, wrapped around the words of the stories she loved. And Seraphine would close her eyes and think, This is what it sounds like when something broken becomes whole. Her hands had healed. Marin's salves and the faint, residual magic of the mate bond had smoothed the blisters into faint silver marks across her palms. Marks that Dragon traced with his fingers every morning, as though reminding himself that she had reached into fire for him and had not let go. On a morning when the mountain air was sharp and clear and the winter roses were heavy with frost, a letter arrived from the lowlands. Seraphine opened it at the breakfast table, Dragon beside her, his hand resting on the back of her chair. It was from her stepmother. The handwriting was shaky, nothing like the imperious script Seraphine remembered from the woman who had erased her name. The letter was short. It spoke of regret, of shame, of the realization, delivered by the formal announcement of the Luna of Ashenmount's identity, that the woman she had sold as tribute was now the most powerful woman in the Northern Territories. Seraphine read it once. Then she folded it, set it on the table, and looked at the winter roses growing outside the window. She wants forgiveness, Dragon said. His voice was quiet. He had read her expression. She wants absolution, Seraphine corrected gently. They're not the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what will you do? She considered. The bruises were long healed. The rope burns had faded to nothing. The girl who had been dragged through Ashenmount's gates with one eye swollen shut was gone, replaced by a woman who sat at the Dragon King's side, who was loved fiercely and specifically, who had walked into fire because she believed that the man inside it was worth saving. Nothing, she said. I don't need anything from her. I have everything I need. His hand moved from the back of her chair to her shoulder, and she leaned into the warmth of him. Real warmth, human warmth, steady and safe. Outside, the winter roses caught the morning light, their crimson petals bright against the snow. And somewhere in the fortress below, the Dragon King's wolves were laughing. The sound carried up through the stone corridors, through the library, through the frost-laced air, and Seraphine closed her eyes and listened. For the first time in 100 years, Ashenmount sounded like home. Where are you listening from tonight? I'd love to know. Drop it in the comments, share your thoughts on Dragon and Seraphine, and if this story found you at the right moment, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you soon.